I like how it gives you the option to leave the meeting once the recording starts, just in case. I think that is nice. Okay, I am going to just kind of move through some of the housekeeping here. So I'm BZ. I am a part of the AGU Early Career Seminar Subcommittee. We've got Ren on the call and Sarah Warden as well. The three of us and our colleague Payush have kind of been coordinating these early career seminars, inviting folks, and then hosting them. And then thanks to Josh for kind of running the platform here. This is just some housekeeping. So we as a committee are here to provide resources for and create and promote professional activities for early career scientists. And so if you know people who are interested, we have a Instagram for the AGU early career section, as well as just kind of some of the other handles that are out there. Please direct people our way. We do record these. You can put them on your resumes. And so we're always looking for more abstract submissions and try to do these seminars about quarterly. The next webinar is probably going to be in October of 24. So the registration or the abstract submission link is here, and Ren will be pasting it in the chat. A few other things. There's a first timers guide to AGU, a webinar planned sometime in October and November. So you can keep your eye out for that. And then also you can keep an eye out for the atmospheric science section newsletters. And you can follow our Twitter account and now this new Instagram account. As the webinar progresses or at the end of it, if you have questions or suggestions, please contact us. There's a form, and again, these links will be in the chat as well for providing feedback. Below is the early career group email, as well as our website. And so without further ado, I now want to introduce our moderator. Cheng Fei is our moderator. He's currently a postdoc at Woods Hole. We went to graduate school together way back in the day at the University of Madison, Wisconsin. So it's nice to see him around again. And he does a lot of research into just climate dynamics, physical processes, and recently got a associate professorship at Northeastern. And so he'll be transitioning out of his postdoc into being a professor. So congrats, Cheng Fei. And I'm going to pass it off to him to introduce our speakers and run the rest of the show. So thanks a lot for joining, and Cheng Fei, take it away.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. So hi, everyone. So welcome to the Early Career Science Seminar today. I'm today's host, Chen Fei. So our topic today is investigations in climate extremes, impacts, and the relationships with the Earth's ecosystems. We have two talks lined up from two extraordinary researchers. Each talk will be about 15 minutes long and with 12 minutes for presentation and also 3 minutes for questions. And after both talks, we will have a Q&A session. So if you have any additional questions, you can ask them then. And now let me introduce our first speaker, Bidut Goswami. Bidut is currently a researcher at the Institute of Science and Technology in Austria. His research focuses on understanding atmospheric convection, its organization, and its impacts on circulation, particularly in the tropics. Today, his talk is titled False Alarms of Indian Monsoon Droughts. Now, Bidut, the stage is yours.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Cheng Fei, for introducing me, and thank you, AGU Atmospheric Science Early Career Committee, for giving me the opportunity to present my results. So I'll be sharing my screen now to, yeah. Yeah, my screen is visible, I guess. It's visible, right? just let me know if it's not. So yeah, as Changfei said, this is the title of my talk, which is False Alarms of Indian Monsoon Droughts. And this work was published in GRL, so you have the a reference at the bottom of the slide. And this was, earlier this year got published. So, okay. Yeah, this would be the outline of my talk. I will briefly introduce an index to how do we actually identify monsoon droughts. So by monsoon, by default, I'm meaning Indian summer monsoon. So I'll be just using monsoon just to save time, and it sounds a little redundant if I keep saying Indian summer monsoon every time. And secondly, I will explain, or I will show the large scale. When I say large scale, it essentially is the sea surface temperature pattern, which is associated with monsoon droughts. And hence, I would say what actually is the alarm in the first place, which activates the alarm, the large scale pattern. And then we'll go to the instances where this alarm is actually false, and that's where I'll introduce the problem statement that I addressed. And then we'll try to identify a detector which can tell us that the alarm is false. Then we'll try to investigate a mechanism behind how these detectors work. And then we'll discuss about some yet unknown issues or things that we still do not understand and the scope of future research. And yeah, to start with, so by the way, every slide will contain a patch of yellow patch at the top, which essentially describe what the slide says. So these are two very like a pictorially how we can see the flood in your left and drought in your right, but we need more scientific way to represent this in to analyze these in our in the data. So before doing that, I just wanted to show how the rainfall, monsoon rainfall looks like, especially. So these are the three panels. IMD means India Meteorological Department, and GPCP and TRIM, I hope you know. And these are rainfall fields, and IMD data is only over Indian landfall. They are just station observations all across the country. And then we do not have those observations over oceans. So we took the data from GPCP over oceans and TRIM. So essentially they show a lot of rainfall during the June, July, August, September months. And then on your right are the interannual variability and intraseasonal variability of Indian monsoon rainfall. So what this tells us is there is very little or relatively less variability if you look at a box. Okay, yeah, if you consider a box in this region, which we know as central India, and then scientists have very carefully curated an index of having spatial rainfall averages over this box and also average over the June, July, August, September months. And that rainfall index, when we plot every year, and based on how the index fluctuates over time, positive and negative, we identify the monsoon drought and flood years. So this is what it would look like if I plot the rainfall over that box for the season of June, July, August, September. And this time series is normalized by its own standard deviation, and these blue dots are flood years, and the red dots are the drought years. And the drought standard definition is when the standard deviation is below -1, then we call it a drought monsoon year. So next, so this is a record of last 117 years, 1901 to 2017, and this is from the Indian Met Department data that I showed in the previous slide. And if I take all the flood years and all the drought years, and take the difference between them in the sea surface temperature field. And this is what the large scale field would look like. And you can probably, people who have worked with features like ENSO or PDO, they would be able to identify this as somewhat El Nino kind of pattern and positive phase of PDO pattern. So this has been this was like people knew it, and this is what activates the alarm in the first place, that when there is an El Nino, then people started to forecast that Indian monsoon would be a drought year because the sea surface temperature pattern of El Nino looks like this. And more so when it is a positive phase of PDO and an El Nino occurring together, then this basically reinforces this pattern that we saw: summer drought minus flood years. And there are studies like Krishnamurti and Krishnamurti 2014. They say when this PDO and ENSO occur together, we may call it a joint phase. During the joint phase, monsoon droughts are actually more severe than occurring only during El Nino, because of the reinforcement of the negative anomaly, or the large scale SST pattern that is associated with drought monsoon years. So the problem statement here is, whenever there is an El Nino or a joint phase of PDO and ENSO, whether we get monsoon drought all the time, or or is it every time, is it the case when we get these negative anomalies, monsoon is drought? Interestingly, it's not the case. And that's why that's where the problem comes, because every time El Nino happens, or a joint phase of positive PDO and El Nino happens, it's not necessarily a drought. In fact, if we combine El Nino and La Nina, 50% of the monsoon years are not exactly associated with the Pacific Ocean SST pattern. And that has triggered a lot of research to understand why there is a drought, even when there is a La Nina, or why there is a not drought when there is an El Nino. So I'm going to change gear a little bit just to statistically see how many droughts and how many droughts are actually false alarms, in the sense that I'm gonna see the special variability of rainfall during pre-monsoon time, so which is basically the motive of this whole research. It comes from the fact that during pre-monsoon time, March, April, May in India, this eastern states of India, they experience a lot of rainfall at a time when the red box, which we termed as central India, there is not much rain happening during pre-monsoon time, and there is a lot of rain happening in this area. And then when we did the calculations, what I found is, in the last 100 years, 56 times when Northeast India or Eastern India pre-monsoon rainfall was above mean, 43 times Central India index showed it was not a drought year. So I continued increasing the threshold, like pre-monsoon rainfall over this part is more than 0.5 standard deviation above its mean, then 29 out of 33 times Central India is non-drought, meaning more than -1 standard deviation. So as we go along, we can see when there is a more pre-monsoon rainfall over this area, then the monsoon rainfall here is more likely to be a non-drought. And it becomes more interesting to see that the rainfall over this area, when I do a correlation of rainfall over this region with the SST pattern, then this pattern is somewhat similar to the pattern which indicates a drought over central India. And that's where the name comes, false alarm, because we see this negative anomalies over central North Pacific, and if there is more rainfall in this region, then despite there is a negative anomaly over the central North Pacific, the monsoon, Indian monsoon is probably is not going to be a drought. So, and again, yeah, this I have already presented that this looks like a joint phase of El Nino and positive phase of PDO. So what the conventional knowledge says is northeast monsoon rainfall over northeast India and central India are negatively correlated. But in this study, we find they're positively correlated, but northeast India pre-monsoon and central India monsoon. And then central India monsoon is expected to be a severe drought when there is a joint phase, but it is a false alarm when northeast India pre-monsoon is excess. So it's more like a confusion than a conclusion, because the whole correlation between the rainfall over east and central, which was conventionally thought to be negatively correlated, when I changed the season to pre-monsoon over eastern side, then the correlation is positive. So we had to look for a mechanism how this can happen. And so this is a very skipping all the details. I'm presenting here roughly the mechanism that the large scale circulation pattern associated. Yeah, thanks. Large scale is pattern associated with this sea surface temperature anomalies interacts with the mountains in this region. You can see this region is actually surrounded by mountains. It's a specific valley with Tibetan Plateau in the north and the local mountains in the south. And they gives rise to barotropic vorticity, which I haven't talked about here in detail, but which basically gives rise to local rainfall. And that local rainfall heats the whole troposphere, which drives the monsoonal flow. This people who have worked with Indian monsoon, they would know that this heating is instrumental in driving the monsoon flow that brings the moisture to eventually give us rainfall. So when there is a more rainfall in this region, that basically preconditions a better monsoon environment for the monsoon to follow, and that's how the positive relation comes from. And then what's next is what we have found out is Northeast India pre-monsoon is a detector of false alarm of Central India monsoon drought. That is, Central India monsoon is a non-drought despite negative sea surface temperature anomalies over Pacific. But what we do not know is Northeast India or Eastern India pre-monsoon, whether it's always excess when there is negative SST over Central North Pacific, which is we do not know it yet. Statistics says it is not, but then we do not know what other factors or other drivers might be doing in that case. So that would be it. And thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the interesting talk. So is there any questions? You can type in the chat or unmute yourself. If
I've got one.
right.
So this was mostly looked like a statistical study. And I wonder what have you explored, or has someone in the literature explored like a dynamical model approach? Because I feel like that can oftentimes be at least kind of elucidate into this concept of driving mechanisms for these types of events. So I'm just wondering if you've come across that in any of your research or thought about that.
Oh, yeah, I think that's the first question that reviewer asked. So so how much can we explain these statistics in terms of dynamics? So people have looked at rainfall over Northeast India, or like if I can pull up the map. Yeah, so the region of India confined within the blue box. So, and they have found relation with the negative anomalies over North and Central Pacific, and somewhat similar mechanism that drives the rainfall over this part of India through a similar mechanism that I also reported in the paper, like the large scale circulations interacting with the local mountains. So there has been a lot of studies that argue or explain a lot of meteorology in this part based on the interaction of large scale circulation with the local mountains. So the only thing new or the major finding of this study was the positive correlation between the blue box and the red box here. So if I take the monsoon season and take a correlation, there has always been a consensus that these two places are, or these two boxes are negatively correlated. Mostly because if I draw a line from 30 north to 95 east diagonally in this box. So that's where the rainy band of Indian monsoon forms. And then when that band moves from south to north, which is the natural migration of Indian monsoon, then essentially because of the tilt of that band, there is these two boxes are negatively related. That was the conventional idea of why these two boxes are negatively related. But then there are more large scale influences which can actually make this gives rise to this positive correlation through some dynamical effect, like heating the troposphere from the rainfall happening in this region. And one primary motive behind looking at rainfall in this region is this enormous amount of pre-monsoon rainfall that happens in this region.
Gotcha. Okay, cool. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, we also have a question in the chat. Alisa, would you like to ask you directly, or I can read it for you?
Sure, I can unmute. Yeah, thank you for the presentation. That was really interesting. My question was, one, have you tried using different precipitation data sets, and do you think that would impact your results at all, or are the same kind of trends seen in different data sets? And then also, I don't know much about monsoon indices, but are the indices, do they take account into like climate change at all as far as increasing rainfall rates over time?
Yeah, and first of all, thank you for bringing this up, like different data sets. So irrespective of any data set, Indian monsoon rainfall over time, at least in the last 5-6 decades, have decreased. So that's essentially the general picture of Indian monsoon evolution over time in the last 5-6 decades. I mean, some studies argue that there has been a revive since 2002 or 4, but that's still debatable. But nonetheless, overall, it has decreased. But yeah, I haven't tried looking at different indices, but then again, my findings are based on overall how the two overall interaction of the large scale with the mountains of the eastern part of India. And no matter what index I choose, this is not going to change. This doesn't change. I mean, if I take GPCP or TRIM, I mean, this is the longest record. That's the reason why I showed it. It's from 1901, but if I take GPCP from, I don't know when it started, I think 70s. And TRIM data has very much, relatively much less data points in this curve. But like, for example, if I take CRU data set, it doesn't change. So these drought and flood years wouldn't change. And I have checked this particular plot, how if it changes with the intensity of rainfall happening during pre-monsoon time over the blue box, which is the eastern part of India, it doesn't change even if I change the threshold of like how I define strong rainfall events during strong season, pre-monsoon seasons of rainfall over the blue box. So yeah, I have checked with different indices or different levels defining precipitation strength, seasonal strength over these boxes. So it hasn't changed, it has not changed.
Great, thank you. So if there is no other questions, so I'm going to introduce our second speaker. So our second speaker is Sanjeev Nagnitham. Sanji is a postdoc researcher at the University of California, Irvine. His research focuses on the impact of environmental stresses on plant volatile emissions and how these changes would affect the atmospheric composition and urban air quality. Today, his presentation is titled Heat Waves Can Induce Terpenoid Emissions from Coniferous Trees and Adversely Impact Urban Air Quality. So, Sanji, please take over.
Hi, everyone. Can you guys hear me? Let me make sure I share my screen here. Hope you guys can see the screen. So thanks, Shengfei, for the introduction and the organizers for organizing this meeting. My name is Sanjeevi, and I'm from UCI, as Shengfei mentioned. And today I'm going to talk about a recent study that our group did. And we just concluded the study and we are writing it up and we are hoping to get it submitted soon. And so we're looking at the effects of heat stress or heat waves on BVOC emissions in urban areas, coming mostly from conifer trees and how they might affect urban air quality. So before we begin, I'm just going to provide some quick background on what are BVOCs. So BVOCs are biogenic volatile organic compounds, and these are trace hydrocarbons that are emitted by plants. So when we think about gas exchange from plants, mostly we think about carbon dioxide and oxygen, right? So those are the main gases that are exchanged by plants. But in addition to those gases, some species of plants also emit small amounts of VOCs. The main one is isoprene, which makes up about 70% of the global BVOC emission, although conifer plants don't actually emit much isoprene. But globally, if you take all plants together, isoprene is the main emission, followed by monoterpenes, which is about 11%, and then some other minor compounds like methanol, acetone, and sesquiterpenes. And biogenic VOCs from plants are the dominant source of atmospheric VOCs. They are larger than anthropogenic VOCs coming from industrial processes and so on. So the function of these different BVC compounds are not completely understood. Biologists have done a lot of research on that. Although in our lab, we mostly look at the atmospheric chemistry impact. So some BVOCs are induced in response to stress, while others are emitted throughout the plant's lifetime or at specific growth stages. So from in our lab, we are mostly interested in the impact of these VOCs on atmospheric chemistry. So BVOCs can react with NOx from anthropogenic emissions, and they can contribute to ozone formation in urban areas. And they can also oxidize and form secondary organic aerosol, which could then contribute to particle pollution, which is why we are interested in this. So in the future, climate's going to get warmer, and that's important because BVOCs are highly sensitive to temperature. So there's this equation here that predicts the increase in BVOC emissions as a response of temperature. So basically, it follows an exponential increase. So temperature on the x-axis and then vapor pressure on the y-axis. So at higher temperatures, we have higher vapor pressure, so you get higher emission. So in most cases, this model works pretty well. But then what we found based on our studies is that for some plants, especially conifers, as you exceed a certain temperature threshold around 40 Celsius, the plant is stressed. So in conifers, the BVOCs are stored within these internal structures called resin ducts or glands. And then at a certain temperature, we believe that this structure breaks down, the membrane ruptures, And then all of a sudden, you have a sudden increase in emission, which is much greater than what model predicts. So that's what we've been trying to study in more detail. And why this is important is because in the past couple of decades or so, you could see that the frequency of heat wave events in the US and also globally has been increasing. Especially in this map, you could see like in Texas and California and Arizona, New Mexico, the number of heat wave events has been increasing quite a bit. And this has this has impacts not only on human health, but also on PVC emissions, which could then impact ozone and SOA. So in our lab, what we've done is we've conducted experiments, enclosure measurements on these plants. So what we do is we either buy potted plants or we go on campus, cut a couple of branches, bring it back to the lab to measure the VOC emissions. So you could see we have constructed this custom-made glass enclosure. So basically, it's just a glass enclosure, and then the plant is enclosed within that enclosure. And then we push in air from, basically we use lab air and then pass it through a couple of filters to remove any VOCs that might be in the air. And then we push the air into the enclosure. And then we measure the VOCs in the air that's coming out of the enclosure. We also measure the CO2 and water vapor, so we know that the plant is indeed photosynthesizing and it's not, we make sure the plant is healthy because you don't want to measure the VOC emissions from a dead plant because then you would get funky results. And for the cut branches, we usually wait for a day or so before we start our measurements just to make sure that the plant is stabilized. So we usually do our temperature experiments from about 30 Celsius, which is kind of like the standard that we use in the models. And then we slowly increase the temperature up to 43 and then 45 Celsius. And then we keep it at 45 Celsius for about 12 hours to see how the emissions change. And then we measure the VOC emissions using a gas chromatography system. And then the photosynthesis and transpiration are measured using an infrared gas analyzer. So you can see that on the picture on the right here. So that's your glass enclosure. And then there's a line, a heated line that goes into our GC system, which is outside of this picture. So now I just want to go through some of our results. So from what we've seen is, so we've conducted experiments on 8 different cypress species. So that's a subfamily of conifers. Not all plants are shown here, but from what you could see at 30 Celsius, the emissions are quite low. It's around, the lowest is 0.06, and then the highest is around 3.4 microgram of carbon. So that's how much carbon it emits per gram leaf mass per hour. And then you can see at the lower temperature end, you have a bit more diversity in the type of BVOCs that are emitted. But that you can see that monoterpenes, which is a C10 biogenic VOC, that's the compound that responds most strongly to the heat stress. So at 45 Celsius, monoterpenes increase much more than the other compounds. So at 45 Celsius, the emission profile is mostly dominated by monoterpenes, non-oxygenated and oxygenated monoterpenes. And then here you could see is a more expanded time profile. So at the emission increase at 30 Celsius, the emission is quite low for most species. And then it kind of increases exponentially with temperature. And in most plants, it keeps increasing up to 45 Celsius. Although in some plants, for example, Tuja, it actually peaks at 43 and then starts dropping. And then in most plants, it keeps increasing with exposure time. Whereas in some plants, it does stabilize or start decreasing. So there is quite some diversity in the time profile. So not all plants behave similarly, which kind of adds some complexity when we try to model these emissions. So I wanted to show a more expanded view of monoterpenes, since this is the BVOC class that actually responds most strongly. So this is a diagram that shows the difference between the model prediction and the actual observations. So the dashed line shows the model, and then this different colored line shows the different species that we've seen, 8 species in total. So you could see that from around 30 Celsius to 40 Celsius, the response of the plants are pretty close to the model. So when you go from 30 Celsius to 40 Celsius, you expect the emission to increase by a factor of around 2.7. So that's what we see for most plants. But then around 40 Celsius, we assume that there's some physical change that happens. So probably the resin duct that stores these terpenes gets broken. So then you have a sudden surge in emissions around 40 Celsius. And now you can see that the emission increases at a much greater rate than what the model predicts. So the Q10 is basically a measure of how much the emission increases for every 10-degree change in the temperature. So the model predicts a 2.7 factor change, whereas what we've seen is about a factor of 7.6 to 22 for most of the species. Its other two species, Thuja occidentalis and C. thyoides, I've excluded it because it actually increases at a much greater rate, around 200 to 300. So those were outliers, but those are much bigger than, those are even higher than what we showed here. And then in most cases, the emissions keep increasing if you keep it at 45 Celsius for 5 out of the 8 species. Whereas for the others, they kind of stabilize or decrease, as I've shown here on the right. And this is just a overview of the different compounds that we see from the different plants. So I've shown examples from 6 different species here. So basically, the takeaway point is that there's quite some diversity in the amount, in the type and amount of monoterpenes that are being emitted. And you could see that even though there's quite a bit of diversity, there's some compounds that are almost always shows up in a different plants. For example, alpha-pinene is a dominant monoterpene that shows up quite frequently. And then limonene is another one. So even though there's quite some diversity between the different species, you could see that certain compounds, they almost always show up in a lot of species. And alpha-pinene and limonene are some of those dominant compounds. Other than that, the other main point that I want to make here is you could see that the change from 30 Celsius to 45 Celsius is quite a lot. The highest increases were seen from American arbor vitae and Atlantic white cedar. So it goes up to around 300 to 200. But the other species also increase quite a bit. And then this is thanks, Shengfei. So this is like a conclusion slide. So here we haven't had that much time to actually do the modeling part. So mostly I've just shown you the emissions from the different conifers. But then the next step that you want to do is we want to input these values that we get, the high emissions that we see when the plants are heat stressed. We want to input these emission values into a global model, Megan, which is something that my advisor has been working on for the last for quite some time. So we want to input these values into a model, and then we want to see how these high BVUC emissions that are induced during heat waves, how they might impact urban air quality. So this is a figure that's taken from Ren et al. 2017. So basically it shows you how BVOCs react with NOx from anthropogenic emissions, and then that forms ozone. And BVOCs can also oxidize to form a secondary organic aerosol, which could then lead to particle pollution, which could then have effects on human health. So our hypothesis based on the heat wave induced emissions is that if we use cypress trees to do large scale urban greening, it doesn't matter if you're just planting a couple of them in your backyard, but if you do a large scale project using cypress trees for urban greening, and if you do it in an area that's prone to severe heat waves, then when the heat wave happens, you could have high emissions of monoterpenes and other BVOCs, which could then contribute to increased ozone and particle pollution, which could then have harmful effects on human health, especially the respiratory problems. But this is just a potential implication. We still need to do some modeling studies to show for sure how much of an impact this would have. And that's something that we still haven't worked on that you would like to work on in the future. So yeah, I think that's all I wanted to say. So if you guys have any questions, I would be happy to answer them. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks for the interesting presentation. So right now, is there any questions? I have one question for you. So I found that the different species change their emission abruptly at like around 40 degrees C. So is there any like biological explanation for this? Because like I suppose they share some common genes, then they just change at that threshold or something like this.
Yeah. So there are several possible explanations for that sudden induction that we see. One possible explanation is the one that you mentioned. So plants have certain genes in them so the production of BVOCs are controlled by genes. So when a plant is exposed to heat stress, certain genes can be turned on, which could then increase the production of those BVOCs. So you would see higher emissions. But for this coniferous plants, most of the monotropin emissions are actually coming from already existing storage structures. So in this figure, you could see there's a canal or duct that's filled with this resin. So the BVOCs or terpenes are already synthesized and they're already in those pools. So our hypothesis is it's not actually coming from gene-induced production. We assume that at 40 Celsius, around 40 Celsius, there's a physical change that happens. So basically the membranes that surround those resin ducts, they probably rupture at around 40 Celsius. So that's like a physical barrier that breaks, and then the terpenes just start oozing or leaking out of those resin ducts. That's why we see a sudden increase. But in some plants, I guess it is possible. People have shown that heat stress will also cause gene level changes, and that causes higher production, higher synthesis rates, and then you would see higher emission rates as well. But for conifers, we hypothesize that the large increase is mostly coming from this membrane rupture.
Wow, very interesting. Thank you. So Alisa has another question in the chat. So would you like to ask directly?
Oh, yeah, I can read it again. So first, yeah, this is very outside my area of expertise, so excuse my ignorance on this topic. But I was just wondering, I know, yeah, BVOCs have a lot of impact for air quality for humans, but do any plant species like rely on BVOCs from other plant species? So as they change with temperature, like would this impact other plants, basically, is my question.
So that's a really interesting question, and we haven't really looked into it that much, but other groups have. So BVOCs are used as a signaling compound. So for example, if you have, so this is not something that we've done, but other groups have done this. So for example, if you have like 4 different plants in the same area, and then you expose one of the plant to stress, that's not necessarily heat stress, could be a different kind of stress, like herbivory. For example, if like an insect or aphid is chewing on one plant, so that plant will start emitting a certain type of BVOC, for example, methyl salicylate or something. And then what other people have found is the other 3 plants which haven't been exposed to the stress yet also start emitting those compounds. So certain BVOCs can act as signaling molecules. We haven't shown that in our study yet because we usually just do a enclosure experiment on just one plant at a time because we don't want to have a plant-plant interaction affecting our measurements. But that's definitely something that would be interesting to see. I can't think of any study where they've looked at heat stress specifically, but other biological stresses like herbivory stress definitely can induce signaling between different plant individuals. Hope that answers your question.
I've got a quick one. I know we're probably running up on time here, but so kind of in your last slide, you were talking about then taking this next step of looking at the modeling of the interaction with BVOCs to produce ozone. I'm just wondering, and again, I don't know a ton about chemistry and pollutants and this stuff, but I feel like ozone comes from a lot of pollutant
Yeah.
sources, right? Like industrial sources, automobiles, stuff like that. Like, can you scale the potential impact from here, like related to ozone pollution in general? Are we
Mhm.
talking about maybe creating 1% or like 30%, or just to get some context?
So that varies wildly. So in the past, biogenic VOCs haven't really played that much of a role because in the past, most of your ozone pollution is actually coming from anthropogenic VOCs because most of your VOCs are coming from like vehicles and industrial emissions. But in the last couple of decades or so, most jurisdictions in the world, especially here, like in the US, they've really like the EPA. And in California, you have the California Air Resources Board. And they actually have put quite a lot of restrictions on the amount of VOCs that cars and industries can emit. Even now, they're trying to really cut down on the VOC emissions. For example, you could only use like low VOC paint and stuff like that. So once the anthropogenic emissions comes down, the BVC emissions, even though they are not much, start to play a much larger role in ozone pollution. I can give you an exact number. I'm not sure on how much is coming from BVOCs as opposed to anthropogenic VOCs. But over time, it's shifting from anthropogenic VOC to BVOC playing a larger role. And that's actually due to us, or at least the governments, playing an active role in trying to bring the anthropogenic VOCs down.
Well, right. So then it's
Mhm.
almost two-pronged, like anthropogenic VOCs are coming down, and
Mhm.
because of the increase in temperature, BVOCs are
Yeah.
coming. Okay,
And
interesting.
also temperature also affects ozone formation because higher temperature reaction temperature usually has an effect on almost all chemical reactions.
Cool. Okay. Thanks.
Yeah, very interesting. So we have another question in the chat from Bidut.
Mhm.
So Bidut, would you like to ask directly, or I can read it for you?
Yeah, I can unmute and ask. So yeah, thanks for the talk. And I was just wondering, because you're in your plots, the x-axis has temperature values which are pretty high.
Yeah.
So these VOC emitting plants, do they have any tropics, extratropics contrast?
So we use 45, around 40 Celsius, just because we are doing mostly studies in temperate regions like in the US and in Europe. So 40 Celsius isn't something that would usually happen. This is like a rare heat wave event, but we assume that in the future it's going to get more and more frequent, especially in like in the US, Europe, even in India. So in terms of between different regions, so our study mostly focuses on like temperate regions. In the tropics, for example, in the Amazon and for example in Southeast Asia, a lot of the plants are isoprene emitters. So isoprene actually isn't emitted by conifers. Conifers don't emit much isoprene. But plants in the tropic, they emit mostly isoprene and also light-dependent monoterpenes. We haven't really looked at those that much. And we're not sure how, because isoprene kind of reacts to the temperature profile is different from monoterpenes. So tropical plants, they emit isoprene and also light-dependent monoterpenes. And from what we've seen from other studies, it actually starts going down at around 40 Celsius to 42 Celsius. And that's because isoprene isn't coming from the storage pool. Isoprene usually comes from direct synthesis. So isoprene is produced and then it's emitted directly after it's being produced. So if the temperature is too high, the plants can't really synthesize isoprene because the enzymes that produce isoprene start to break down. So the emission actually starts coming back down. So it's kind of like an enzyme activity curve. So I would assume that in the tropics, the temperature profile would be different, and that probably has a different effect on ozone and particle pollution, because the maximum is going to be around 40 Celsius, but it's still going to be higher than at 30 Celsius. So it starts coming down around 42 to 45. But if you compare it to 30 Celsius, it's still higher. I don't know if that answered your question, but
Yeah, thank you.
yeah.
Great. So now I think we could start our Q&A session. So if there is any other questions for our two speakers, please ask right now.
Yes, I could stop sharing. Am I still sharing? No, right?
Yeah.
Oh, man. Sorry, how do I stop sharing? Oh, here.
Okay.
Cool. Sorry about that.
So, Bidut, I actually have a question for you. So for your time series of the rainfall in the Indian, so I can observe like there is very obvious multi-kilo variability in it. So, and I'm wondering, so like because you mentioned like PDO and so how about the AMV impacting the Indian monsoon?
How about, sorry, I missed the last part. How?
The Atlantic multi-kilo variability,
Oh, yes,
AMV.
yes. Yeah, so there has been a very recent study which addressed the flood years during La Nina years. Sorry, non-La Nina years. So traditionally, this flood years are associated with La Nina and drought years are with El Nino. But then the exceptions, like, yeah, the exception years were investigated by one study, and they found this Atlantic SST has some role to play. There has been several other studies which says over time the impact of Pacific has decreased, meaning the correlation between Indian monsoon and ENSO has decreased, but then Indian monsoon and Atlantic Nino has increased. But then again, these are all evolving observations. So we do not know whether those correlation themselves will have some multi-decadal variability or they're going to stay as long as the climate continues to warm. So we don't know why the nature of correlation has been changing. But of course, there is a part which is not related to the warming climate, which says there is, of course, a definite relation between El Nino, Atlantic Nino and Indian Ocean drought or floods, per se.
Got it. Thank you. Very interesting. Yeah.
I have another quick question for Sanjeevi, if we have time. I think it's a pretty quick one. Do you think your results could be have implications or be implemented into some like chemistry models? I know there's some like air quality type models that try to predict impacts. So do you think, yeah, you're going to try to implement your results in those?
Yeah. So our colleague, my colleague Hui and Yingnan, so they are both postdocs in our lab. So they are the modelers in our lab. Actually, I mostly do the experiment stuff. But yeah, they're gonna try to use these values and put it in the model is called Megan, the model for emissions of gases and aerosols from nature. And I think that's part of the CESM model. So in the CESM model, you could use Megan to figure out how much VOCs are coming from biogenic sources. And then you could then use that to figure out the effects on climate chemistry climate and atmospheric chemistry. So that's something that we hope to do in the near future. So because in the models, usually we don't the impact of heat stress on biogenic emissions isn't completely constrained in the models. So we are hoping that the values that we get from our lab experiments could then inform us about what kind of values to use in the model to figure out how much the emissions will increase when temperature gets higher. So that's something that we hope to work on in the near future. Mostly my colleagues will be working on it, but I'll be providing some data from my experiments.
Thank you. So is there any other questions? This is time to ask.
think we're coming up
So
on,
if there, yeah, please go on.
I was just saying, we're coming up on the hour here, so.
Oh, okay. So yeah, so I think so if there is no other questions, so I think we can stop here. So thanks again for our excellent speakers today. Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, and thanks for running the show, Cheng-Fei. Good to see you.
Thank you. Yeah.
All right, so long, everybody.
Take care, guys.
Bye.
Bye.